This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. You can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Melbourne and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA, that's A-A-S-A, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. This is a scholarly society devoted to animal studies. I'm a member and I encourage you to become one too. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. This series includes several books exploring animals in Victorian Britain, which is a subject related to what we're going to be talking about today. And that includes Obaish, a hippopotamus in Victorian London by John Simons. Also a quick shout out to Elizabeth Usher, who provided the updated theme tune for Knowing Animals. To learn more about Elizabeth, visit veganfused.com. Now, this is a very special episode for me, as for the first time, I'm interviewing someone who taught me when I was an undergraduate student. Joining me today is Professor Alison Stone. Alison is a professor in the Department of Politics, Philosophy and Religion at Lancaster University in the UK. She's authored 9 academic books and edited or co-edited 3 others on assorted topics in feminist philosophy, continental philosophy and aesthetics. But I've invited her onto Knowing Animals to talk to us about her current work on women in 19th century philosophy, and in particular her work on Frances Power Cobbe. Alison is the editor of Frances Power Cobbe, Essential Writings of a 19th Century Feminist Philosopher, released by Oxford University Press in 2022, and the author of Frances Power Cobbe, a short book in the Cambridge Elements series Women in the History of Philosophy, which was released by Cambridge University Press also in 2022. Welcome to the podcast, Alison.
Hello. Thank you for having me, especially as I'm not an animal studies person per se.
So could you start by telling us what led to you working on Cobbe?
So a few years ago, I began wanting to know about women's contributions to 19th century philosophy because there's been a huge amount of work rediscovering all the past women philosophers. It used to be thought that there weren't any women philosophers in the past, and basically people have realised that there were. It's that they've been missed out of the canon and missed out of the historiography, but they were there. So people have been rediscovering all these figures, but they've not much looked at the 19th century. I started off looking at, in fact, literature about 19th century feminism, because there's quite a lot of existing literature on that, tracing the roots of modern feminism. And one of the books that I looked at was Barbara Kane's book, Victorian Feminists, and she spent quite a lot of time talking about Cobbe, and she mentioned that Cobbe saw herself as the philosopher of the women's movement in Britain. So my ears then pricked up. When I began to look into Cobbe, I realised straight away that she had written on a huge amount of areas of philosophy. She'd written about moral theory and nature of moral knowledge, and religion, philosophy of history, aesthetics, as well as feminism, and of course lots about animals and animal ethics. So she did all this stuff, and yet curiously, people looking at women in the history of philosophy have not really rediscovered Cobbe very much at all. So that's my mission at the moment.
I think some listeners will have a rough idea of who Cobbe was, but I think others will be really drawing a blank here. So let's start with the basics. Can you give us a sketch of who Cobbe was and why she might be of interest to contemporary scholars of animal studies?
Absolutely. The first thing to know is She really coincided in terms of when she was alive with the Victorian period, because she lived from 1822 to 1904. And so she was publishing and thinking really from the 1850s right up until her death. She was born in Ireland, and as an adult she moved to London ultimately, and then she eventually retired to Wales. So she was really a major presence in Victorian intellectual life, and she published lots of books. I've already mentioned the fact that she wrote on all these different areas of philosophy, but she published lots of books, lots of journal articles. She also wrote quite a lot of journalism, so she was a leader writer for a newspaper at the time. And the reason why she would be of interest to people here is that she was also very concerned about animal welfare. And she was effectively the leader of the movement to limit and then to abolish vivisection or animal experimentation. It was a big issue. Many of the listeners probably know this. In Victorian Britain, and in the Victorian period worldwide, it was a huge issue. So Cobb was really central in campaigning against vivisection, as well as writing about philosophy. And in fact, they came together, because I think that she was campaigning first to limit and then to abolish vivisection on a philosophical basis, based on the moral theory that she had already worked out. And one thing maybe I should mention here as well is that it might perhaps to some people seem a bit surprising to sort of think in the Victorian period that there was not just Cobbes, in fact, but lots of women who were really quite prominent in intellectual life and political campaigning and all sorts of things, because we have a bit of a stereotype that the period was one where women were kind of more or less under house arrest and not really allowed to do anything at all. And the reality was a lot more complicated than that. So it was quite possible for you to have someone like Cobbes, who at the time was a very high profile figure, pretty much a household name, really.
So, could you give us a quick introduction to her ethical framework?
In a way, her basic principles, they can be stated really quite simply. So she thought moral obligations together constitute a moral law, and to have a law, you have to have a lawgiver or a legislator. And for her, that had to be God. It couldn't be that, say, we give the moral law to ourselves as agents, because she thought then we could take it away again whenever we want to. So it has to come from a higher authority, namely God. So her moral theory, it was an intrinsically religious theory. And when you look at her work, religion absolutely pervades it, as it pervades a lot of British philosophy at this time. But she also reciprocally, just as she thought that moral obligations depend upon God, she also thought that this provides an argument for the existence of God, because there are moral obligations and God must exist in order for us to have these moral obligations. So he does exist. So the two kind of supported one another. She started off setting this moral theory and religious theory out in kind of general terms, and it was only subsequently that she came to look at what it implied with regard to animals.
Yeah, so I guess we're thinking here of her paper, The Rights of Man and the Claims of Brutes, which is probably the most animal-focused essay that you include in the essential writings. So how did she come to start writing about animals, bearing in mind she was in many ways one of the first, perhaps even the first philosopher to write seriously about animals in this way? So how did she come to start writing about animals, and what did she say?
She got concerned because she read reports in the press about animal experimentation in France at a veterinary college there, and it was experimentation specifically on horses, and they were undergoing really horrible torture, ostensibly for the sake of educating veterinary students, but it's very unclear that it was really serving any educational purpose at all. But she more generally as well than that, she was aware that animal experimentation in mainland Europe particularly, it was by now beginning to be quite central to science and medicine. There were plenty of practitioners who didn't use anaesthetics at all, even though they were available. And of course, in this time generally, animal experimentation, it wasn't regulated at all. So this was what Cobb wanted to do, was to introduce regulation. But so she was coming into a situation where there wasn't any. And animal experimentation was becoming more common in Britain as well. So she really wanted to kind of get some regulation and ethical standards in place at the beginning, as it were. You asked about her essay, The Rights of Man and the Claims of Brutes. And I should mention, she uses the word brute, which was completely accepted at the time. So she didn't mean it pejoratively. She wrote this paper, really, this was her first attempt to work out what should be the ethical principles that should regulate vivisection. I should maybe mention as well the word vivisection, because people now more often would speak of animal experimentation. So I suppose it strikes me that there's two reasons for that. One is that animal experimentation sounds a bit less loaded to begin with, but also the problem with the vivisection as a word, in hindsight, is that it doesn't cover all the forms of animal experimentation, because it means dissecting a living being, and not all experimentation is dissection. But Cobb uses vivisection basically to mean any animal experimentation, so she uses it in a broader sense. So anyway, what she started off arguing about the moral framework that we ought to adopt was to say that we have a fundamental duty to increase the happiness and reduce the suffering of all sentient beings, all of them. So no distinction between humans or animals at that point. But then, in The Rights of Man and the Claims of Brutes, she says, nonetheless, although we have this general duty to increase happiness and reduce suffering, it's also right that we prioritise those who are our nearest and dearest. And it's right that we prioritise human beings because human beings are moral agents. But, as she stresses, prioritising them doesn't mean that animals count for nothing at all. But what she did think followed from it was that humans could legitimately sacrifice animal happiness at times if it was strictly necessary for them to do so in order to satisfy genuine interests, sort of real needs on the part of human beings. And for her, that meant that there was a case for regulating vivisection and limiting it to where it was strictly necessary in order to find out new truths that had important medical applications. And it had to be done with anaesthetics, unless there was some exceptional reason why not. And that it could be done only to that extent. So those are the limits of legitimate vivisection. And I realise as I'm saying it that of course it probably sounds quite obvious and also quite weak. And she herself came to think that it was much too weak. But that was where she started off.
Yeah, so let's think a little bit about the reasons that she herself ends up rejecting the view. And she does say, I think, in that original paper, that she's setting out something that she takes to be quite obvious, although interestingly, she ceases to believe it later. I know she wrote loads of work later on, both what we would now call academic work and much more activist work and journalistic work about vivisection. But in your Cambridge Elements book, you discuss one particular paper, which is Zoophilae, which you published nearly 20 years after The Rights of Man and the Claims of Brutes. And by this point, antivivisection had really become the primary focus of her life, you say. So could you introduce us to Cobbes' later views?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that caused her to change her mind was what happened in terms of the regulatory legislation that came in. So this was a huge turning point for her in her thought, because she wanted regulatory legislation to come in, and she gathered a group of supporters around her and did a lot to sort of mobilize public opinion and so on. And she and this group drafted some proposed regulatory legislation, which was presented to Parliament. Cut a long story short, that set off a huge round of wrangling and a royal commission and all sorts of contestation about the legislation. And what ended up being passed in 1876 was the Cruelty to Animals Act. So it kind of took earlier legislation against cruelty to animals and extended it to scientific cruelty for the first time. From Cobbes' perspective, what came in was so unacceptably weak compared to what she had initially wanted that she, at that point, basically gave up on the idea of being able to regulate vivisection. So as she saw it, the final version of the laws that were passed, the Cruelty to Animals Act, which, and she thought it kind of came in with the right name, that rather than protecting the animals from scientists, it ended up being a piece of legislation in her eyes that merely protected the scientists from undergoing any outside ethical scrutiny. One can take different views on it, but she didn't. So that was a key thing that led her to think that vivisection just had to be abolished. And that was the position that she then began to take from 1876 onwards. That was one shift in her thought, from regulation to abolition. And another one that went along with that was a shift from reason to the emotions. So in that earlier paper, The Rights of Man and the Claims of Brutes, it's really very much a rational framework for how we should treat animals, kind of starting with this basic principle about the duty of benevolence and then working out what's rationally required. And she came to think that the emotions were much more important than that. So in some of these later papers, she puts forward the view that what we really need to do is have the right feelings towards animals, which are feelings of sympathy and compassion and care for fellow creatures. From that perspective, she said vivisection was just altogether wrong, that it involved the wrong attitude, the wrong set of feelings towards animals, and that even if you were using anaesthetics, she now said, you still have to be kind of training yourself to not have an emotional response to the animal that you're experimenting on, but just to kind of treat this creature as if it was a mere piece of non-living matter that you can do what you want with. And this is just the wrong feeling for her. So those two changes of mind on her part sort of went together, kind of from regulation to abolition and from reason to emotion.
I see. And I know this is something you will have thought a lot about from reading your introduction to the essential writings, but why did you not include, say, Zoophile or one of these later pieces of antivivisectionist work, given that these were Cobb's developed views on the matter?
I know. I initially wanted to. So initially, I wanted to include a lot more stuff, but there were word limits, as there always are. I mean, so that's, one can never really use that as much of an excuse. And I was aware when I included the Rights of Man essay by Cobb. I mean, I think she would be exasperated to see what I included. So partly I couldn't include very much about animals because I wanted to sort of show that she wrote across all of these different areas of philosophy. And then I also came to think that even though she really changed her mind, if I was going to have just one thing of hers about animal ethics, that it still had to be that early essay from 1863, just because it was kind of the starting point from which all the rest grew. There's many other things of hers that I could have included. So there's another great one as well, the moral aspects of vivisection. It's another really interesting one, partly because she was against utilitarianism. But nonetheless, in that paper, amongst other things, she basically says, well, we shouldn't be utilitarians, but if you are a utilitarian, you should be against animal experimentation anyway. And for lots of reasons that have come up in the later 20th century. So she says, as a utilitarian, you shouldn't be prioritizing merely hypothetical future long-term happiness over the immediate suffering of lab animals that you can sort of see right in front of you. And she also makes the argument here that human pains and pleasures shouldn't be weighted more heavily than those of animals. And there were people in her time who wanted to do so. And she said that this was merely a new form of race selfishness. There's essentially the concept of speciesism. There's an absolute mine of ideas and arguments in her work about vivisection, particularly, and animal experimentation.
Well, that's fantastic. And I really hope that other animal ethicists and other historians of philosophy can start to dig into them and to really find what's there preempting other people and what's there that maybe is quite unique to her. But I wanted to ask you about another aspect of her animal ethics. And that was part that quite surprised me, actually. And that was that she was opposed to vegetarianism. I was very interested as well to read about Anna Kingsford's criticisms of Cobb on this front.
Absolutely, yeah. And you're quite right to say that the vegetarianism issue, it stands out in contrast to all the things I've just been saying about ways Cobb anticipates more recent discussions. This is where she's very different. She was against vegetarianism because she thought that eating meat is a physical necessity for us. Vegetarianism was also, it was quite a thing in Victorian Britain as well. So she was arguing against something that many of her allies, in fact, were in favour of, because she thought that we have to eat meat to survive. She thought they were basically recommending that we have to sacrifice ourselves, which she thought was demanding too much. And she thought that the most that could be done in terms of the fact that we have to eat meat, the most that we can do is to treat the animals that are being farmed for meat humanely and give them a good life. And in fact, she already put forward the argument that if we weren't raising them for meat, then they wouldn't exist at all. So it's still better for them to have some existence, even if they then end up being humanely killed. It's still better for them overall, as long as they are treated humanely while they're alive. One of the people who disagreed with her about this, it was this woman, Anna Kingsford, who was also really involved with the anti-vivisection movement and was, however, a vegetarian, and also in fact was medically trained as well. But so she argued that human beings can live perfectly well on a vegetarian diet. So for her, we should abolish vivisection because it involves harming animals, and we should stop eating meat, which also involves harming animals. Whereas for Cobb, one of these isn't necessary and the other one is. So for Cobb, the two cases of scientific use of animals and meat eating were different, whereas for Kingsford, they were similar. It is quite odd with Cobb in a way to see how when it comes to vegetarianism, she sort of uses many of the kinds of arguments against it that the pro-vivisection people would put forward against her to defend vivisection. So something that I should say to try to justify her views a bit more or explain them is she did address the question from people, why vivisection? Why are you so focused on this one thing? Why is this so much worse than all the other forms of cruelty to animals? And she did say that the other forms of cruelty to animals, such as hunting and other forms of inhumane treatment of animals, they're also wrong. But vivisection for her was distinctive because it was a product of modernity. And that was what, for her, made it unique. Which makes me wonder whether, if she had lived to see factory farming, she would have then regarded it in much the same way as she saw vivisection.
You mentioned earlier that Cobb was almost a household name in her day. So why is it that, given how famous she was, and given that she was corresponding very closely with people as famous as Charles Darwin, that she's been so overlooked and so forgotten?
Yeah, I think there's all sorts of reasons. So I think it hasn't helped that she is so religious. That's one factor. What I suggested in The Element about Cobb is that the anti-vivisection itself became a factor because it did really come to take over her life. And it did set her against many of those people who'd been her interlocutors, including Darwin and all sorts of other then prominent scientists. She kind of made herself the enemy of the scientific establishment. So I think this must be part of the reason for why she's come to be forgotten and left out of the history of philosophy to the extent that she has. For so much of the 20th century in philosophy, applied philosophy, it was just seen as this is not really philosophy at all. I mean, I can remember some of this from when I was a student. You know, at one point, one of the philosophers in the department where I was, when I suggested doing some teaching and teaching some applied philosophy, the person said, look, I'm the only person in the department who thinks that's actually philosophy. There was so much hostility to it. This was one of the central things that Cobb was doing. You know, she was doing applied philosophy, kind of animal ethics, sort of far ahead of it becoming recognised. And for most of the 20th century, philosophers in Britain would have just been like, writing about vivisection, this isn't philosophy. So I think that is probably a factor as well. I mean, there's lots and lots of factors, but I think those are some of them.
Before we move on to our regular questions, I just wanted to draw attention to a line that I underlined when I was reading the essential writings. You note that contemporary animal ethicists, even feminist ones, seldom recognise Cobb as their forerunner. Hopefully, this collection will help correct this. I can certainly empathise with the goal of acknowledging and appreciating our intellectual ancestors. And you've also pointed out some really interesting ways that Cobb is saying things similar to contemporary animal ethicists and distinct from contemporary animal ethicists. But to what extent do you think we can feel the ripples of Cobb's work today?
Two things to mention: organisations and legislation. So, in terms of organisations, she was one of the founder members and the sort of central founder of what was initially called the Victoria Street Society, and then it came to be the National Antivivisection Society, which still exists. And later, after Cobb fell out with the other people in that society, she then founded the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection, which still exists. Again, it's now called Cruelty Free International. Sometimes when you buy various household products, you'll see the cruelty-free logo on it. So that's a legacy of Cobb. And another is the legislation. So I was talking earlier about the 1876 Cruelty to Animals Act. And however inadequate it may have been, at least in Cobb's eyes, it remained the basis of the law in this country for a really long time, right up until 1986. So that was a huge influence. And although, Cobb would probably say about that, well, look, this shows what a hopeless piece of legislation it was, because it was in place for all this time, while, the number of animal experiments performed every year. I mean, in her time, it was in the hundreds, and, by 1986, in the millions. So she would have said, well, this just confirms it's actually just a charter for people to get on with experimenting on animals. But the counter view is that still having that law was a step in the right direction. It's surely better than not having anything at all, I would say. And I really doubt that the 1876 Act would have ever come in if it hadn't been for Cobb's initiative. So all of those the ripples that we can feel from her life. What I wish I could say is that, well, it would be nice to be able to point to more ripples within animal philosophy and animal ethics. And I'm afraid there's not very many ripples at all. I mean, I do hope that will change, especially because of digitization, because now so much of what she wrote, it's just there on the internet, freely available, in a way that wasn't true throughout the whole of the 20th century. I mean, I think that's another factor in why she became forgotten as well, that, unless you were going to be grubbing around in the archives of libraries, it was much harder to find, whereas now it's all sort of there on the internet.
Now, Alison, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions, and I'm really excited about your answers here because, as you said right at the start, you're not obviously an animal studies person, though you are, of course, very interested in someone who was herself very interested in animals. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Certainly one of them, unexcitingly, was Animal Liberation. Another, which is maybe a bit more interesting, is this book by Keith Thomas, Man and the Natural World. What I really wanted to say by answer is, as a child, I think I was hugely influenced by lots of novels about animals. So, in fact, Black Beauty, which is from, the same period, the same context as Cobb, and this book, Hurry Home Candy, it's about a family who buy a dog for Christmas and then get fed up with the dog fairly quickly and sort of all the rest of the poor dog's life. I remember having a particular phase as an older child when I absolutely loved this author, Joyce Stranger, who did all these books about animals and animal-human relationships. They're quite realistic and quite bleak.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Well, this one is difficult to answer because, as we've said, I'm not an animal studies person as such. But the answer I'm going to give is to refer to my first book, which was about Hegel's philosophy of nature. Hegel's often seen as being quite hostile to nature and in favour of the creative powers of the human mind and human reason. But I was arguing that he sees the human mind as emerging from the animal mind, and the animal mind, animal life from other forms of life, and those forms of life from a kind of latent life within the whole of the universe. But in his political philosophy, nonetheless, Hegel claims that we have a right to do whatever we want with animals and with other natural entities. But I argued that that conflicts with his metaphysics. But I mean, I have to say, I was deliberately taking someone who's not very promising as regards nature and animals and putting forward a counter interpretation. And these days I tend to think, let's just look at the more promising candidates.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Of course, I have to say Cobb, even though she's not generally recognised so much as an animal studies scholar, but I think she probably ought to be seen as one of its founding figures, really. But if you want me to mention someone else, so as to diverge from Cobb a bit, I would like to mention a book called Women Against Cruelty by Diana Donald, which is about women's contributions to animal welfare and animal protection in 19th century Britain. And I want to mention it just because I think it's such a model of kind of historical scholarship on both restoring women's contributions and remembering all the campaigning and activism that's gone into making life better for animals.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
Thinking in terms of philosophers here, I think an important thing that philosophers could try to do is to stop having generalised human-animal contrasts of the form humans reason, animals don't, or humans have temporality, animals don't, humans have concepts, animals don't, humans have a world, animals are poor in world, and all these endless things, because it's still really entrenched. I just so often come across these kind of generalized statements in work by philosophers, and on this, at least, I agree with Derrida that these contrasts are really just ways of bigging up the human being and using the animal as a foil.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Well, I found this the hardest of your questions because as soon as you name anything, it seems so limited and insufficient. So I'm just going to mention one of Cobb's suggestions that came up earlier, where she says, okay, maybe we can't reach a consensus on what are the right actions towards animals, but perhaps we can agree about the right feelings. And she thinks the right feelings are sympathy and compassion. And this is connected to the suggestion of hers that we also mentioned earlier, where she says that if there's some practice that relies on treating a living and intelligent creature as if they were just a piece of inanimate matter, then that practice, she had vivisection in mind, of course, that it embodies the wrong sort of attitudes and draws out the wrong feelings from us. And so in those cases, there's something wrong with the practice.
What are you working on next?
So I have a book which is called Women Philosophers in 19th Century Britain, which comes out next year, but it doesn't really go into animal ethics. But one of the future things that I want to do is to look at a number of the women philosophers of 19th century Britain, specifically on animal ethics. Partly because I would like to go into more depth about Cobbes' thought on this over time, but also because there were lots of others who had interesting things to say, such as Anna Kingsford, who we mentioned earlier, but also Annie Besant and a woman called Julia Wedgwood. And in fact, the other theosophist, Helena Blavatsky, she became involved in the vivisection controversy as well. So there's lots there. So I hope to write something about all that.
And how can people find out more about your work?
Basically, I would say if you Google Alison Stone and Cobbe, you should be able to find several of my blog posts regarding Cobbe, or you could look at my Lancaster University webpage, which points to some of my research, or you can have a look on things like academia and ResearchGate.
Well, thanks so much, Alison, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook, and you can just find us at Knowing Animals. You can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Please do tell others about us and review the podcast where you found it. We're keen to reach new listeners. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.